Syria, 2022. Part 1. The Discovery. The sun barely pierced through the thick layers of smoke and dust that hung over the outskirts of Aleppo, casting an eerie, muted light on the ruins below. Once a bustling suburb, the village now lay in desolation, its streets lined with the skeletal remains of buildings, shattered by relentless bombings. The echoes of distant gunfire and the occasional thunder of artillery served as a grim reminder that the war was far from over. Dr. Amir Khalid, a seasoned doctor with Medicine Sans Frontieres, carefully navigated the rubble-strewn streets, his senses on high alert. Every corner, every shadow, was a potential threat. Yet, amid the ruins, he remained focused on his mission: to bring medical aid to those who had been left behind, too injured or too fearful to flee. His medical bag, worn and heavy, was his constant companion, a lifeline in a world where life seemed to hang by a thread. The makeshift hospital, set up in what had once been a school, was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The building itself was barely standing, its walls cracked and scorched, windows shattered, and the roof partially caved in. Inside, the hallways echoed with the sounds of hurried footsteps, whispered prayers, and the pained cries of the wounded. Classrooms, once filled with the laughter of children, were now crowded with patients lying on makeshift beds, their faces etched with pain and exhaustion. Dr. Amir had seen more than his share of suffering. The war had dragged on for years, turning once vibrant cities into graveyards of dreams and hopes. He had treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and the ravages of disease and malnutrition. Yet, each day, the weight of the suffering around him grew heavier, chipping away at the faith that had once sustained him. He had been raised to believe in the inherent goodness of people, in the power of compassion and healing. But here, in the heart of a war that seemed endless, those beliefs were constantly tested. On this particular day, as Amir searched for medical supplies in the remains of a nearby mosque, something unusual caught his eye. The mosque, once a place of peace and reverence, was now a hollow shell, its minaret toppled, its prayer hall filled with debris. As Amir carefully sifted through the wreckage, his hand brushed against something solid, buried beneath a layer of dust and broken tiles. He unearthed a small, ornate chest, its wood darkened with age, intricate patterns carved into its surface. The lock was broken, likely shattered by the force of the blast that had reduced the mosque to ruins. Curiosity piqued, Amir pried open the lid, revealing a bundle of old, weathered parchment inside. The papers were yellowed, the edges brittle, but the ink that covered them was still remarkably clear. As he gingerly unfolded one of the parchments, Amir realized that it was no ordinary document. The text was written in an ancient script, one he did not immediately recognize, interspersed with symbols and diagrams that seemed almost otherworldly. His heart raced as he scanned the lines, trying to decipher their meaning. Though the language was foreign, there was something about the words that resonated deep within him, as if they were speaking to a part of his soul that he had long neglected. He couldn't shake the feeling that this manuscript had survived for a reason, that it had been hidden away, waiting for someone, waiting for him. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was a man of science, trained to rely on empirical evidence and rational thought. Yet here he was, in the ruins of a war-torn village, holding a document that seemed to defy all logic and reason. Amir knew that he couldn't leave the manuscript behind, not when it might hold answers to questions he hadn't even known he needed to ask. He carefully placed the parchments back into the chest, wrapping them in a cloth to protect them from further damage. As he did, he noticed a small inscription on the inside of the lid, written in a more familiar script. It was a verse from the Quran: "In the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest." The words struck him like a bolt of lightning, bringing tears to his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words until that very moment. With the chest securely tucked under his arm, Amir made his way back to the hospital. The streets seemed even more desolate than before, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. The war had taken so much: homes, lives, faith, but it had not yet taken his resolve. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder what the manuscript held. Was it a relic of the past, or a message for the present? Did it contain the wisdom he needed to navigate the moral and spiritual quagmires of this war-torn land? By the time Amir reached the hospital, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the village in shadow. The makeshift hospital was a flurry of activity, but Amir's mind was elsewhere. He needed to understand what he had found, needed to know why it had called out to him. He retreated to a small, dimly lit room that served as his quarters, carefully setting the chest on the table before him. As he began to study the manuscript, the noise of the hospital faded into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. The text was dense, the symbols intricate, but Amir was determined. With each line he read, he felt as though a veil was being lifted, revealing a truth that had been hidden from him all his life. Yet, the more he read, the more questions he had. Who had written this manuscript? Why had it been hidden away in the mosque? And most importantly, what was it trying to tell him? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear. This was not just a relic of the past. It was a living document, one that seemed to hold the key to his future. The night wore on, and Amir lost himself in the manuscript's pages, oblivious to the world outside. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wall, he finally set the parchment aside, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that his discovery was just the beginning, that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges and dangers he could not yet imagine. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, there was a purpose to all of this. And so, with the manuscript safely tucked away, Dr. Amir Khalid prepared to face another day in the war-torn streets of Aleppo. But now, he was armed with something more than just medical supplies and a steadfast resolve. He carried with him the words of an ancient prophecy, a guide that would lead him through the darkness and into the light. Part 2. Inner Conflict. The sun climbed higher over the desolate village, casting harsh light on the crumbling buildings and war-torn streets. Inside the makeshift hospital, the day was already in full swing, a frenetic blend of urgency and desperation. The school building, barely standing after years of conflict, was now the last refuge for those too wounded or ill to escape. Its corridors, once echoing with the laughter of children, were now filled with the sounds of suffering. The groans of the injured, the soft weeping of those who had lost loved ones, and the ceaseless shuffling of feet as nurses and volunteers rushed from one patient to the next. Dr. Amir Khalid moved through these hallways with practiced efficiency, his mind focused on the immediate tasks at hand. Each day was a relentless onslaught of challenges: severe injuries, limited supplies, and the constant threat of further attacks. Yet, despite the chaos that surrounded him, Amir found himself increasingly drawn to the ancient manuscript he had discovered. It was as if the words on those old parchments had rooted themselves in his mind, coloring his thoughts and influencing his actions. The manuscript had become his constant companion, its verses running through his mind as he tended to the wounded. At first, he had been skeptical of the power it seemed to hold over him. But now, as the coincidences began to pile up, he couldn't deny that something was happening, something beyond the realm of logic and science. One such coincidence occurred early that morning. A young girl, no older than 12, was brought into the hospital, her body limp in her mother's arms. She had been caught in the blast of a nearby bombing, her small frame riddled with shrapnel. Amir was called to the emergency room immediately, where he found the girl pale and unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. As he prepared for surgery, Amir couldn't help but recall a passage from the manuscript he had read the night before. It had spoken of a child, a beacon of hope, who would be saved by the hands of the faithful. The words echoed in his mind as he worked, guiding his hands with an almost supernatural precision. The surgery was long and arduous, the stakes impossibly high, but Amir felt a calm confidence settle over him, as if he were being guided by a force greater than himself. Hours later, the girl emerged from the surgery, alive but fragile. Amir watched as she was wheeled to a recovery room, the weight of what had just occurred pressing heavily on him. He had seen so many lives slip through his fingers, lost to the cruelty of war. Yet this time, something had been different. He couldn't shake the feeling that the manuscript had played a role in her survival, that its ancient words had somehow intertwined with his actions, creating a miracle in a place where miracles were rare. But the manuscript's influence didn't end there. As the days wore on, Amir began to notice more and more instances where its verses seemed to predict the events unfolding around him. A line about a righteous man of faith coincided with the arrival of a local cleric who brought much-needed medical supplies to the hospital. Another verse, speaking of a healer who would be tested by fire, seemed to foreshadow a devastating attack on the hospital, from which Amir barely escaped with his life. These coincidences, if they could even be called that, began to weigh heavily on Amir's mind. The manuscript had become both a source of guidance and a burden, its cryptic messages leaving him torn between his scientific training and the growing belief that he was part of something much larger than himself. The struggle was internal, a battle between the rationality that had defined his life as a doctor and the spirituality that was beginning to take root in his heart. Outside the hospital, the conflict raged on. The once bustling streets of Aleppo were now deserted, save for the occasional flash of movement as soldiers and civilians alike sought cover from the relentless shelling. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and blood, the sky a perpetual gray from the smoke that billowed from burning buildings. But inside the hospital, a different kind of battle was being fought, one that tested the limits of human endurance, faith, and morality. Amir found himself in the center of this struggle, his every decision carrying the weight of life and death. He began to question the ethics of his work in ways he never had before. Was he truly helping these people, or was he simply prolonging their suffering in a world that had lost its humanity? The manuscript seemed to suggest that there was a higher purpose to his actions, a divine plan that he was a part of, but Amir couldn't shake the doubts that gnawed at him. His interactions with the people in the hospital only deepened his internal conflict. The patients came from all walks of life: Muslims, Christians, Kurds, Arabs, men, women, and children. Their suffering was universal, transcending the divisions that the war had imposed upon them. Amir's work brought him into contact with imams, priests, and ordinary people who held fast to their faith even as the world around them crumbled. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Amir found himself in the hospital's small prayer room. The room, once a classroom, had been repurposed as a space for reflection and worship. A simple prayer rug lay on the floor, its colors faded and worn, and a small altar had been set up against one wall, where candles flickered weakly in the darkness. Amir knelt on the rug, the manuscript clutched in his hands, his mind racing with questions he had no answers to. The verses he had read earlier that day spoke of a light in the darkness, a beacon that would guide the lost to safety. He wanted to believe that he was that beacon, that his work in the hospital was making a difference. But the doubts persisted, whispering to him that he was just one man in a world consumed by hatred and violence. As he prayed, the room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing down on his shoulders, the weight of the manuscript heavy in his lap. He felt a deep sense of despair, the kind that had become all too familiar in recent years. But as he continued to pray, something shifted within him. It was as if the manuscript's words were reaching out to him, offering him a lifeline in the storm of his thoughts. The struggle was not over, not by a long shot. But in that moment, Amir felt a flicker of hope. Hope that he was not alone in this fight, that there was a purpose to the suffering he witnessed every day. The manuscript had become more than just a relic of the past. It was a guide, a source of strength that he could draw upon in the darkest of times. As the night wore on, Amir emerged from the prayer room, the manuscript carefully wrapped and tucked away in his bag. The hospital was quieter now, the patients finally resting, the staff taking a brief respite before the next wave of casualties arrived. Amir knew that the struggle would continue, that the war would rage on, and that he would face challenges that would test him to his core. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a belief that he was exactly where he was meant to be. And so, with the manuscript's verses still echoing in his mind, Dr. Amir Khalid prepared to face another day in the makeshift hospital. The struggle was far from over, but he was no longer fighting it alone. Part 3. The Revelation. The war had spread like a wildfire, engulfing everything in its path, and leaving behind only ashes of what once was. As the conflict intensified, Dr. Amir Khalid knew that the makeshift hospital could no longer bear the weight of the suffering it held. The steady flow of wounded had become a torrent, and the hospital's resources were stretched to the breaking point. The situation grew increasingly dire, and Amir realized that he needed a brief reprieve, not just from the physical demands of his work, but from the emotional and spiritual toll that had taken residence in his heart. It was during this time of overwhelming pressure that Amir decided to leave the confines of the hospital, if only for a few days. He had heard of a remote refugee camp, far from the front lines, where civilians had taken refuge from the horrors of war. The camp was said to be a place of relative peace, a sanctuary amidst the chaos. Amir's hope was that, in the stillness of this camp, he might find some clarity, a chance to reconcile the turmoil within him. The journey to the camp was treacherous. The roads were pockmarked with craters, and the remnants of burned-out vehicles lined the path. Amir traveled with a small convoy of aid workers, their vehicles moving cautiously through the desolate landscape. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and decay, the sky an oppressive gray that seemed to mirror the hopelessness of the land below. When they finally reached the camp, Amir was struck by the stark contrast between the outside world and the community that had formed here. The camp, though modest, was a place of resilience. Tents and makeshift shelters dotted the area, but there was a sense of order and cooperation that had emerged from the shared experience of survival. The people here, mostly women, children, and the elderly, had faced unimaginable loss, yet they had found strength in each other, in their shared faith, and in the hope that the war would one day end. Amir was greeted by the camp's leaders, a small group of men and women who had taken on the responsibility of organizing the daily life of the camp. Among them was an elderly imam, a man of quiet dignity and deep wisdom, who had become a spiritual guide for many of the camp's inhabitants. The imam welcomed Amir warmly, sensing the heaviness in his heart, and offered him a place to stay. As the days passed, Amir immersed himself in the life of the camp. He tended to the sick and injured, offering his medical expertise wherever it was needed. But more than that, he spent time with the people, listening to their stories of loss and resilience, and offering what comfort he could. The camp's atmosphere, though marked by the hardships of war, was also infused with a sense of community and faith that Amir found deeply moving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the camp, Amir found himself sitting by a small fire with the imam. The two men had spoken briefly before, exchanging pleasantries, but this evening felt different. The imam, sensing Amir's inner turmoil, gently inquired about what weighed on his heart. Amir hesitated, unsure of how to explain the strange and powerful effect the manuscript had on him. But something in the imam's calm presence encouraged him to speak openly. He told the imam about the manuscript he had found, about the verses that seemed to predict the events unfolding around him, and about the inner conflict that had taken hold of him as a result. The imam listened intently, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the fire. When Amir finished, the imam remained silent for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. Then, with a gentle nod, he began to speak. "The manuscript you have found," the imam said, "is more than just a relic of the past. It is a message, a guide for those who are lost, for those who seek truth in a world filled with lies. But it is not a guide in the way you might think. It does not offer clear answers, nor does it dictate the path you must take. Instead, it reveals the choices before you, and in doing so, it asks you to look within yourself, to find the faith and courage that you already possess. Amir absorbed the Imam's words, feeling a deep resonance with what he was hearing. The manuscript had indeed presented him with choices that had tested his faith, his ethics, and his understanding of the world. But it had not provided easy answers. Instead, it had forced him to confront the complexities of his own beliefs, to grapple with the moral dilemmas that had arisen from his work in the war zone. The Imam continued, "In times of great suffering, it is easy to lose sight of our faith, to question the very foundations of our beliefs. But faith is not about certainty. It is about trust in the divine, in the goodness of others, and in the journey we are on." The manuscript is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found. It is a beacon, not because it shows us the way, but because it reminds us that the way exists. The words struck Amir with the force of a revelation. He realized that he had been searching for something external to guide him, when in fact, the answers he sought were already within him. The manuscript was not a map, but a mirror, reflecting back the questions and doubts that had been brewing in his soul, and challenging him to find his own way forward. In the days that followed, Amir's perspective began to shift. He continued to read the manuscript, but now with a different mindset. Rather than looking for literal interpretations of the verses, he began to see them as metaphors, as prompts for introspection and spiritual growth. The manuscript became a tool for reflection, a way for Amir to explore his own beliefs and to reconcile the contradictions that had plagued him. The camp itself became a place of healing for Amir, not just physically, but spiritually. He found solace in the Imam's teachings, in the resilience of the people around him, and in the quiet moments of prayer and meditation that he had so often neglected. The struggles of the outside world still weighed heavily on him, but here, in the relative peace of the camp, he began to find a sense of clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as he sat once again by the fire with the Imam, Amir spoke of his renewed faith, of how the manuscript had led him to this place, not just physically, but spiritually. The Imam smiled, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. "Faith is a journey," the Imam said, "and it is never a straight path. It is filled with twists and turns, with moments of doubt and moments of revelation. But as long as you keep moving forward, as long as you keep searching for the light, you are on the right path." Amir nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. The war was far from over, and his work in the hospital would continue to challenge him in ways he could not yet imagine. But now, he knew that he was not alone in this journey. The manuscript, the Imam, the people of the camp, they were all part of the path he was meant to walk. As the fire crackled softly in the cool evening air, Amir closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey he had been on, for the guidance he had found, and for the strength he would need in the days to come. And in that moment, he knew that the revelation he had sought was not in the manuscript, but in the journey itself. Part 4. The Moral Dilemma. The return to the besieged city felt like stepping back into the jaws of a beast. The roads leading to Aleppo were no longer mere paths, but treacherous veins coursing with the lifeblood of war. The landscape was a grim testament to the relentless conflict: burnt-out shells of vehicles, craters from mortar shells, and the skeletal remains of buildings that once stood as proud symbols of civilization. Every mile closer to the city intensified the oppressive sense of danger that hung in the air like a thick fog. As Dr. Amir Khalid re-entered the makeshift hospital, the atmosphere inside was markedly different from when he had left. The once hopeful buzz had turned into a muted hum of desperation. The hospital, overcrowded and under-resourced, was struggling to keep up with the endless stream of casualties pouring in from all directions. The wounded were crammed into every available space, their pained cries echoing off the peeling walls. Nurses and volunteers moved like shadows through the dim corridors, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Amir immediately resumed his duties, falling back into the rhythm of triage and treatment with practiced ease. But something within him had changed during his time at the refugee camp. He carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, yet this sense was quickly tested as the war continued to wage mercilessly around him. The conflict outside the hospital walls had escalated to new heights, with both sides committing to all-out assaults on each other. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their lives reduced to mere collateral in a struggle for power. The hospital, meant to be a sanctuary, was constantly under threat, its very existence hanging by a thread. One afternoon, as the sounds of distant gunfire reverberated through the city, a group of soldiers burst through the hospital's doors, carrying with them a man whose injuries were severe. Amir was called to the emergency room, where the man was laid on a gurney, his uniform bloodied and torn. The insignia on his chest marked him as a high-ranking officer, one whose reputation was known far and wide. This man, Major General Khalid Mansour, was infamous. He was a figure feared and despised by many, his name synonymous with brutality and cruelty. His tactics had left countless civilians dead, and his orders had been responsible for some of the most horrific atrocities committed during the war. And now, he lay before Amir, fighting for his life. The room was thick with tension as Amir assessed the situation. The general's injuries were extensive: shrapnel wounds, a fractured leg, and severe blood loss. The medical team awaited Amir's decision, their eyes betraying their uncertainty. They knew the man before them was a monster, yet they also knew that their oath as medical professionals demanded that they save lives, regardless of the person's deeds. Amir's hands trembled slightly as he prepared for surgery, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. The manuscript, now a constant presence in his mind, offered no clear guidance. Its verses spoke of compassion, of the sanctity of life, but they also spoke of justice, of the need to protect the innocent. Amir found himself at a crossroads, torn between his duty as a doctor and the moral implications of saving a man who had caused so much pain. The operating room became a battleground of its own, a place where Amir's faith, ethics, and humanity were tested to their limits. The minutes stretched into hours as he worked to stabilize the general, each decision fraught with significance. The medical team moved with precision, their movements synchronized, yet the air was heavy with the unspoken question. Was this man worth saving? As the surgery progressed, Amir's thoughts drifted to the manuscript, its cryptic verses resonating in his mind. One verse in particular stood out: "To save one life is to save all of humanity." The words echoed in his ears, a reminder of the deep-rooted beliefs that had driven him to become a doctor in the first place. But the manuscript also contained darker passages, ones that spoke of the consequences of allowing evil to flourish unchecked. Amir's internal struggle was palpable. He had seen the horrors of war firsthand, had witnessed the devastation wrought by men like Khalid Mansour. To save this man's life was to allow the possibility of further suffering, further bloodshed. But to let him die was to betray the very principles Amir had sworn to uphold. The surgery reached its climax as Amir made the final incisions, his hands steady despite the turmoil within him. The room was silent, the tension thick as the general's fate hung in the balance. Finally, Amir completed the procedure, stepping back from the operating table with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Khalid Mansour's life had been saved, but at what cost? As the medical team wheeled the general into the recovery room, Amir felt a profound sense of emptiness settle over him. He had done what he was trained to do, what his faith and ethics demanded, but the decision left him questioning everything he believed in. Later that night, as Amir sat alone in his quarters, the manuscript laid out before him, he sought solace in its words. But the verses that had once provided comfort now seemed distant, their meanings elusive. He had saved a life, but the moral weight of that decision pressed down on him like a heavy burden. The manuscript had not provided answers, only more questions. Questions that Amir was not sure he could answer. The days that followed were filled with a pervasive sense of unease. The general, now conscious and recovering, expressed no gratitude, no recognition of the lives that had been lost under his command. Amir avoided him, unable to reconcile the man he had saved with the suffering he had witnessed. The hospital staff, too, struggled with their feelings, their interactions with Amir tinged with a mix of respect and confusion. Amir's internal conflict deepened, manifesting in restless nights and a growing sense of isolation. He found himself questioning not only his actions but the very nature of the manuscript itself. Was it truly a guide from a higher power, or was it merely a reflection of the chaos that surrounded him? The moral dilemma he had faced with the general was one he could not shake, a wound that festered in his soul. In the end, Amir knew that the manuscript's true test was not in the decisions it prompted, but in the aftermath of those decisions. It had forced him to confront the complexities of war, faith, and morality, to question the very fabric of his beliefs. And while the answers remained elusive, one thing was clear. The journey was far from over. As the conflict outside the hospital walls raged on, Amir understood that he would face more challenges, more dilemmas that would test the limits of his faith and his humanity. The manuscript was no longer just a guide. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of his soul, forcing him to confront the man he was and the man he needed to become. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with unanswered questions, Dr. Amir Khalid prepared to continue his work, knowing that the moral dilemmas he faced were not a sign of weakness, but of the complexity of the human condition. The manuscript had shown him that there were no easy answers, only the relentless pursuit of what was right in a world that often seemed devoid of justice. Part 5. The Ultimate Test. The city of Aleppo had become a symbol of devastation, its once grand architecture reduced to rubble, its streets littered with the remnants of a society on the brink of collapse. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and death, and the sky, once bright and blue, was now perpetually shrouded in a gray haze. The sounds of war, gunfire, explosions, and the anguished cries of the wounded echoed through the empty, desolate corridors of the city. The final siege had begun, and with it, the last flickers of hope seemed to be extinguishing. Dr. Amir Khalid stood on the roof of the makeshift hospital, staring out over the ruins of the city. The manuscript, now worn and frayed from constant use, was tucked into the pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. The past weeks had taken a toll on him, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He had faced moral dilemmas that had shaken him to his core, and the weight of the decisions he had made lingered in his mind like a heavy fog. The siege had cut off all supply lines to the hospital. Food, water, and medical supplies were running dangerously low, and the number of patients continued to swell as the fighting intensified. The once vibrant makeshift hospital had become a grim fortress, its occupants huddled together in the dark, clinging to the last vestiges of their faith and humanity. Amir had done everything he could to keep the hospital functioning. He had organized rationing, coordinated with the few remaining volunteers, and continued to provide medical care to the wounded. But he knew that their time was running out. The hospital had become a beacon of hope for the people of Aleppo, but now, it was little more than a final stand against the inevitable. One evening, as Amir was preparing to perform surgery on a young boy who had been caught in a mortar blast, a loud explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the hospital into darkness. Panic spread through the halls as people scrambled for cover, their fear palpable in the confined space. Amir's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to assess the situation, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The explosion had taken out the hospital's generator, leaving them without power. In the darkness, Amir heard the voices of the wounded and the frightened, their cries merging into a cacophony of despair. He fumbled for his flashlight, the small beam of light offering little comfort in the oppressive blackness that surrounded him. Amir's thoughts turned to the manuscript. He had read and reread its verses countless times, searching for guidance, for answers. But now, in the midst of this chaos, he found himself questioning whether the manuscript had truly been a guide. or whether it had simply been a reflection of his own fears and doubts. The words that had once brought him solace now seemed distant, their meanings obscured by the reality of the war that raged around him. As he made his way through the darkened corridors, Amir came across the young boy's mother, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her son's lifeless body. The boy had died while Amir was preparing for surgery, a casualty of the explosion that had plunged the hospital into darkness. The mother's grief was overwhelming, a raw, primal cry that pierced through the noise and chaos. Amir felt a deep sense of failure settle over him, a crushing weight that threatened to drag him down into the depths of despair. He had dedicated his life to saving others, to being a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed devoid of justice. But now, he felt as though he had failed, that all his efforts had been in vain. As the night wore on, Amir retreated to a small room at the back of the hospital, the manuscript laid out before him. He stared at the pages, his mind numb from exhaustion and grief. The verses that had once seemed so clear were now a blur, their meanings lost in the fog of war. It was then that Amir heard a voice, soft and gentle, speaking to him in the darkness. It was the voice of the Imam from the refugee camp, the man who had helped him find clarity and purpose during his time of spiritual crisis. The Imam's words echoed in Amir's mind, "Faith is a journey, and it is never a straight path. It is filled with twists and turns, with moments of doubt and moments of revelation." Amir closed his eyes, allowing the Imam's words to wash over him. He realized that the manuscript had not been a guide in the traditional sense. It had been a mirror, reflecting back to him the struggles and doubts that he had carried within him all along. It had forced him to confront the darkness in his own soul, to wrestle with the moral dilemmas that had arisen from his work in the war zone. The true test of faith, Amir realized, was not in the absence of doubt, but in the willingness to confront that doubt head-on, to continue to strive for what was right even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The manuscript had shown him that there were no easy answers, only the relentless pursuit of what was just in a world that often seemed devoid of it. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the walls, Amir rose from his seat, the manuscript clutched tightly in his hands. He knew that the siege would continue, that the hospital would soon run out of supplies, and that many more lives would be lost before the conflict came to an end. But he also knew that he could not give up, that he had to keep fighting for the lives of those who depended on him. With renewed resolve, Amir stepped out into the dim light of the hospital corridor, the manuscript still in his grasp. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that he would continue to face moral dilemmas that would test the limits of his faith and humanity. But he also knew that he was not alone, that the people of Aleppo were depending on him to be the beacon of hope they so desperately needed. And so, with the weight of the manuscript in his hands and the words of the Imam in his heart, Dr. Amir Khalid prepared to face another day in the besieged city. He knew that the ultimate test of his faith was not in the decisions he made, but in the strength to carry on in the face of adversity, to continue to fight for what was right in a world that often seemed devoid of justice. In the end, Amir understood that the manuscript was not just a relic of the past. It was a living document, one that had guided him through the darkest moments of his life and had shown him the way forward. It had been a beacon of light in a world consumed by darkness, a reminder that even in the midst of war, there was still hope, still a reason to keep fighting. As the sun rose over the ruined city of Aleppo, casting its first rays of light over the devastation, Amir stood on the roof of the hospital, the manuscript held close to his heart. He offered a silent prayer, not for himself, but for the people of Aleppo, for those who had lost their lives, and for those who continued to fight for a better future. And as he spoke the final words of his prayer, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. The journey was far from over, but with the manuscript as his guide, Amir knew that he would continue to fight for justice, for humanity, and for the hope that still flickered in the hearts of the people he had sworn to protect. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.